Evening, everybody, and welcome back to Bristol Talks Economics. Tonight, we're thrilled to be joined by Wendy Carlin, a professor of economics at UCL, and perhaps most importantly for our purposes here tonight, a director of the International Core Project. Wendy, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
It's a pleasure.
So as ever, I'd just like to remind everyone that if you've got questions throughout the hour for Wendy, please pop those in the Zoom chat and I'll field them to Wendy whenever is appropriate during the discussion. So first of all, Wendy, I'd just like to ask, you started your journey, and it's been quite a long journey in more ways than one, from studying comparative literature at Murdoch University in Western Australia to getting a PhD in economics at Oxford. So can you tell us a bit more about how you made that journey and how that sort of diverse international education has benefited your career since?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the fact is that at school I did sciences, and so I did physics, maths, and chemistry. I also did German and English literature. And of those subjects, English literature was the only one that was kind of critical, where you kind of analyzed a text in a critical way. And I'd not really heard of social sciences. So I thought that that's the kind of thing I wanted to do. And I went to this university the first year it started. So that was a kind of rather radical thing to do. And it was a great university because in your first year, you did a very broad course. You could choose between 3 different courses. And one was called something like Structure, Thought and Reality. That sounded a bit zen. So I chose Population and World Resources. And doing that, like a multidisciplinary course, I kind of realized that pretty soon that I didn't really want to be doing comparative literature. I wanted to be doing social science. And then I kind of honed in on economics, that if you didn't understand economics, you couldn't understand the world. So that was the kind of the turning point. And then the fact I'd done maths and so on made economics also a good fit. And then when I'd done that, I ended up in Oxford. So if you're Australian, there are these things called Rhodes Scholarships, and you can get them if you somehow do certain sort of odd things. But I got one and ended up in Oxford, and that was very, very alarming. It was autumn. It was horrible, dark grey. The buildings were all really awfully grey, and it was very, very depressing coming from Perth, Western Australia. So anyway, I managed to survive, and here I am still here. Actually, I am in Oxford, so it can't have been all that bad.
I think we're going to be talking a lot tonight about paradigm shifts, shifting intellectual winds, and it's probably hard for us kind of as economic students today to sort of understand what it was like when you were studying. So could you perhaps outline, I think it's probably a lot more the neoliberal era when you were studying, what that was like and what your impression of that was, whether you felt like that was correct at the time, or whether you felt even then that something was perhaps wrong?
Yeah, that's interesting, sort of reflecting back on it. I think, again, my education in a completely new institution had a really had a big effect on me. And again, the contrast when I came to Oxford was absolutely dramatic. So when I was in my undergraduate education, I actually had quite a broad education in economics, economic thought, and I was introduced to different schools of thought, something that is not always the case for students studying now. And then when I went to Oxford, I was kind of thrown into a very standard, at the time, master's training program, which was really rooted in the kind of mid 20th century paradigm. So even though there were people there who were really instrumental in the information economics revolution, like Jim Mirrlees, for example, the teaching was still centered around general equilibrium modeling. And so, yeah, so that's, I wasn't there in the middle of the last century, I have to emphasize, but there are kind of lags in economics teaching. So yeah, so I think I had a kind of broader basis than these. But I also had a very strong drive to use economics to understand problems in the world. And when I chose my dissertation in the master's program, and then I developed it further in the PhD, I wanted to focus on a really existing economy, not begin with a model. So, and since I was in the UK and I assumed I would know much less about the UK than loads of other people, I decided to choose somewhere else that seemed important and interesting. So I worked on the West German economy. And that was very influential, actually, in everything I've done in economics since, because I focused on the transformation of the war economy into the post-war so-called German economic miracle. So that was, and it was really amazing trying to figure out how this economy was operating in the 1940s after the end of the war, when there wasn't a functioning currency, and then seeing how the pieces were put together and which pieces actually really mattered as compared with the sort of myths about the German miracle in driving West German economic growth. So I was interested in institutions and the rules of the game from that starting point.
So I'm just trying to understand then, perhaps, would you have considered yourself perhaps an outlier in the research you were looking at that time, taking a core technique? If you'd drawn a word cloud of your master's or PhD group, would they have come up with similar things to you? Or do you think even then you were perhaps thinking differently to other economists around you?
Probably somewhat differently. Not many people were doing sort of theses in economics that had a strong economic history component, which mine did. And I was probably more Catholic in choosing theoretical frameworks to apply. So I used very standard frameworks, but I also used some that were more unusual. So there was a Hungarian economist called János Kornai, and he had a model of what he called a vegetative economy. And it turned out this was actually a really good way of thinking about the bilateral exchange economy that operated in the western zones of Germany immediately after the war. So yeah, I think I was more driven by having a problem and then looking for theoretical models that would shed light on the problem I was interested in. Whereas other people were sometimes starting from a model and then, in a sense, looking for an application. And I've always kind of worked the other way around.
Yeah. So this seems to hint at sort of the conception of core. So could you talk a bit more about how core actually came into being? And obviously this was a gradual process for you, always wanting to look at problems first, but was there a particular key point perhaps around the financial crisis where you thought, this is it, I need to do something now about this?
Yes, yeah. So there was a lot of pressure around the time of the financial crisis coming from students, and students played an absolutely pivotal role in the whole movement to try and reform economics teaching. And I was there in the front line. I was teaching a course in macroeconomics, and you know, the students were saying, hey ho, you know, can you explain what's going on? And that turned out to be quite challenging. So the first thing I did actually was to dedicate a few years to finding out about how the banking system works and how to integrate the financial system into the macro model. So I sort of did that before I felt I could sort of take a bigger question of, you know, is there something broader that we should do about economics education? And then the step towards core really was a step to saying, this is not about one person, this is about drawing a community together of people, of researchers with different kinds of expertise, but all oriented towards bringing the best of contemporary research, because contemporary research had really come a long way between when I was doing my PhD and then, and there was a sense that there was a new, what we call a new benchmark that could form the basis for a new way of teaching at the undergraduate level. And so the challenge then was to kind of pull together a group of people who thought this was an important enough thing to do to take them away from their research for a certain amount of time, because it was a lot of work.
So is that something you think there was building already? Would that have still been possible without the catalyst of the financial crisis, or was that change sort of in moral sentiments needed to actually get the project across the line, to get, like you say, to get people to dedicate time away from their research?
Yeah, I think it was the financial crisis. There was another trigger. There was a strong push from a very different place, which was from a group in Chile, where again it was students who were high school students actually who were going on strike and occupying their schools, and university students were helping them. And there it was nothing to do with the financial crisis. It was all to do with inequality and the failures of the education system in Chile. And the students there kind of marched back to their university and said, hey ho, how come we're doing this degree in economics and we haven't heard the word inequality in all these years? So just like my students were saying, we haven't heard the word crisis, we know nothing about banks. These were like the pressure points that made us think, okay, something has to be done. But the idea that something could be done that was coherent, that would put these different pieces together, could only come out of trying to do it, right? Nobody had a kind of grand plan.
Mm-hmm. And of course, Chile is a fascinating example because obviously they were sort of run by the Chicago Boys, weren't they? Which is a very neoliberal market orthodoxy, and then that's obviously potentially contributed to the rapid inequality rise in Chile, which is again what the core project is a reaction against. So
that's right. So privatization of the schools, for example. Yeah, that's like a classic neoliberal policy. So it was interesting to have such a different context producing the same complaints, if you like, on the side of students, that they were not being equipped in their studies with tools that would help them understand what was going on and understand the problems that they were interested in.
I know we said that probably most people in the audience will be very familiar with core, but is it worth you just sketching out this benchmark model just so everyone's absolutely clear, and maybe a bit of revision?
Yeah. So the idea is that for a long time, the benchmark model that people were taught, and by that we mean things like what do people like, right? So the answer to that question, what do people like? So in the benchmark model, people are self-regarding, and they're very far-sighted. So and that's where you start from as your benchmark. And in the core benchmark, people are self-regarding, but they also have other regarding preferences, and we have to understand situations in which the latter are important. And people are also hampered by cognitive limitations. And so that the insights, if you like, of behavioral economics become a defining feature of the new benchmark. So that's one element. There's another element of what the economy is. So in the new benchmark, the economy is placed within the biosphere. So that's a central definition, rather than in the standard benchmark, the economy is here, and you just think of some sort of external effects appearing and defined as a market failure, rather than thinking that the way you conceptualize the economy is that it's part of society and part of the biosphere. And then you've got a whole number of other dimensions, one of the most important of which is the assumptions about information. So as soon as you step away from a world in which information is complete, you enter a world of asymmetric information and of incomplete contracts. And this kind of can sound very, abstract, like incredibly theoretical, but what it does is that it means that as soon as you move into a world of incomplete contracts, there is a role in economics for power and for social norms, because they're the things that complete the contract, right? You can't pin things down in a contract. So that's what confers power in relationships, for example, between employers and workers. And without that concept of incomplete contracts, and you can think about it in credit markets as well, you've got no language, you've got no concepts. You can't bring in a whole number of dimensions of how the economy works and how it doesn't work very well.
Yeah,
so that's so, you know, and we can talk about there are lots of other there's a whole series of dimensions of the benchmark. But if you want to, if anyone's interested, then the easiest way to find the comparison is to go to you can just Google it, an article in the Journal of Economic Literature, and I'm sure Ben can actually give you the reference. And I think it's something like table 3 in there, has like these columns, and you can just check out. You can just read across the columns and look at the standard benchmark and compare it with the new one.
Just want to quickly ask at this stage, perhaps the comeback to that would be the idea that, oh, Homo economicus is just a straw man that's used to simplify the maths at a very basic level, and nobody actually believes that at a higher level of economics. Is that accurate in any sense, or is that just people outside the discipline?
No, I think that it really matters what you consider your central case. So you can, in the conventional benchmark, you consider your central case Homo economicus interacting with his kind usually, but anyway, interacting with other Homo economicus in price-taking markets that clear. Okay, and then you introduce a bit of imperfections here and there. But that's the central model of the economy. And what we're arguing is that that should not be your central model of the economy. That, for example, in the labor market, you should never see this, ever. No clearing labor market. It's never the case that the labor market clears. And there's a reason for that. As soon as you have imperfect information and incomplete contracts, then you must always have some involuntary unemployment. There's always excess supply in the labor market. And that's a very different conception of your base case than is a model of a clearing labor market. So yeah, I think it really matters.
Yeah, I think, yeah, your point about the central case is key, because I was looking back at Friedman's classic about the social responsibility of business to increase profit. And even in that, he says shareholders make as much money as possible while conforming to the basic rules of society. But it's because it's tacked on there at the end, it's sort of forgotten. And like you say, you have to emphasize that in your base case, don't you, for it to really hit home, yes. Yeah,
I think that's true. And I think that's the sense in which we can talk about this sort of set of paradigms that are followed one after the other, and try to make the case that we are at the stage of constructing a new one, and that we have to, because the problems that we confront cannot be addressed just by introducing some marginal imperfections into the preceding paradigm. So I think that's why, you know, there's a lot of talk, a lot of chatter out there about, you know, what's wrong with sort of a neoliberal paradigm. But the real challenge is to think of how to create a better one, and to think of what the building blocks have to be to have one that's sufficiently robust that it can provide a genuine alternative for people to, you know, invest in, bring in their research, and take it to the level of policy and to everyday discussion about, you know, people's lives and their future and their hopes.
Yeah, let's talk about this new paradigm then, because you wrote a fascinating article, I think it was last year, about using machine learning to look at Paul Samuelson's textbook and how that had changed over time between editions. And you talk about this being another Samuelson 1948 moment. Could you explain to everyone exactly what you mean by that?
Yeah, okay. So the idea, in fact, Samuelson 1948 is absolutely fascinating book. So I'd really recommend anyone to take a look at it. Because if you've just heard about Samuelson, you've probably heard about Samuelson like in much later editions, when Samuelson and Nordhaus by then became just like Mankiw. Okay, so but Samuelson 1948 was really a paradigm shifting book. And what he did was he took the best of economic research that had developed a way of providing an explanation for the persistence of unemployment. So the Depression was the challenge to the preceding, if you like, the classical liberal paradigm, which had no satisfactory economic model to address this problem, this major phenomenon. So what economists did, and obviously it was Keynes and all of the other people working on the problem, they developed new theory that could address this problem. And what Samuelson did was he then wrote a textbook that took it from being a model, an economic model, that was coherent with a different set of values relative to the classical liberal ones. So he took that and he showed how you could teach it, and you could tightly connect it with the policies that were being implemented. So this book, this Samuelson book, you open up the first page and he says, my job as an economics professor is to help my students to understand what's going on in the world. And the first question that he asks is, so question 1 in your first problem set is, how do you think you would fare in the next depression? Right? And it's all about, so the whole first part of the first and second part of the book is about building up modeling to equip you, the citizen, the future economist, to understand and engage with this new post-depression world. So yeah, it is pretty fascinating, actually. And so what we did was we took all of economics research for 100 years, and we extracted from that research. I mean, that's an exaggeration, all of economics research, but the research published in the so-called top journals. And we then used this topic modeling that some of you may have used for other purposes, to extract a series of topics, 100 topics and the topic modeling, what it does is that these topics, could have written this corpus of research. And then once you've got the topics, you can then look at how over time, how the themes in research have changed. But for our purposes, we're actually interested in using it to look at how textbooks had changed over time. And yeah, so if anyone's interested, again, it's in that Journal of Economic Literature article.
Yeah, what I thought was so good about that is it feels like core is something completely new, like was just like ripping up the old stuff, but it's actually, as Samuelson said, he was trying to look at the really interesting and vital problems of overall economic policy, and then he would return to the classical verities later on. But I guess the great thing about core, because it's online, because it's collaborative and constantly being updated, I guess we may never have to return to the classical verities. Is that
what he was, that's an absolutely fascinating that you picked up that couple of sentences, because it is really fascinating. I mean, in a way, he was saying that if it works, so if the Keynesian policies work, then it could be the case that we return to a situation in which there's an end to persistent unemployment, and then we could, with a bit of kind of hand waving, imagine that we could return to the the economics of Marshall Pigou as our sort of basic economics. And he stuck that all, so the economics of price and value, he stuck it all at the back of the book and said, you know, okay, fine about that, but what we really got to do now is to work on this other stuff. And yeah, core being updated, this is a message to everyone. There are still loads of mistakes, so we are constantly correcting the book, updating it, as you say, updating the data, and we're always very, very, very pleased to get suggestions and corrections. The errata is, yeah, it's a headache, but it's very important.
One of the slightly
this is
more
crowdsourcing corrections.
One of the slightly more niche thing I think is so good about core. I was reading the paper by Foucan, Olian, and Algan from 2015 about the superiority of economists. I think perhaps if you're a non-economist in the audience, you might not be aware of just what an interesting bunch economists are, and like particularly been found in survey experiments, well, actual practical experiments, to be more selfish and more confident in their own policy prescriptions. How important an aspect of core do you think that is, the fact that it's collaborative and it was people giving up their time voluntarily rather than being
I think that's really, it is really important. I think people really did, I mean, if anyone ever did a calculation of the number of hours that have been donated to the project, then it's really, it dwarfs enormously the dollars or pounds that have fueled the, you know, getting the online stuff and so on. So yeah, economists, I think, shouldn't be kind of all tarred with the same brush. I think that what it's really awakened is a sense of community, but also of people bringing their practice as researchers into their teaching in a way that they never really crossed their mind before. So as in all science and other academic pursuits, people tend to become very specialized. And it's only by bringing together a lot of really expert specialist people that you have a chance of creating something coherent that in economics is so important, because we're trying to understand this really complex reality. So we have to have people with knowledge of economic history. We have to have people with knowledge of IO, of labor economics, of development, and so on and so on. And then the big challenge has been to put those things together. And there, you know, I think we have done something quite important. But as you say, it is very, very important to keep a sense of humility. And economists are a really arrogant bunch. And it's partly because we're being asked to kind of to comment and to also to formulate policy that really matters. And you know, if you're standing up tomorrow delivering the budget, then there's no point saying, well, actually, you know, I'm probably wrong about this. It's not going to really work out in the way that I'm telling you. And you know, if I really put my confidence bands around this, you know, you'd be really, you know, you wouldn't really have much faith in me when I talk about the way that I think the national debt is going to, the trajectory is going to go. So I don't think it's all the fault of economists. I think it's partly sort of the job. But on the other hand, there's too much arrogance. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, like you say, it's that tricky line to tread, because economists do have so much sway over policy making, far more than any other social science. And there's a great quote just at the end of that paper. It says, self-confidence is the greatest achievement, but also the Achilles heel of the discipline. And it's just recognizing that, yeah, like with great power comes great responsibility, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's why, you know, in teaching and, you know, trying to get, because part of our job is to really encourage the next generation, to recruit people to become economists, even if you don't become an economist, to be, you know, to love economics, because, you know, we need like evangelists out there to say this can be a really powerful tool, can really be a powerful tool, but we have to find ways both of communicating its power, but also communicating the limits of what we can do. And that's really an art, and we have to get better at doing that, I think.
Yeah, and certainly you could say economics as a whole is definitely more of an art than a science at times. I was going to bring this in later, but just because you mentioned recruiting into economics, how do you think we're doing in terms of, are there too many economists nowadays? There's certainly lots and lots of undergraduates. I know obviously there's still a gender balance issue, but overall, is there an oversupply of economists perhaps, or do we still need?
No, I don't think so. I think actually, I mean, it's the question. So one question is, what people end up doing in their job, but there's a different question which is about education, and I think that economics should be part of every child's education, because economics is about understanding how the world works. And so it should be in primary school. It should be in secondary school. It should just be part of your engagement with the world out there. And that, I don't know how to get that sort of idea into the curriculum. So it's probably a bit too ambitious to say, we've changed the way undergraduate economics is taught. Now we maybe change primary school, but someone else can have is surely better suited to do that. But I think so in that sense, I think a really wide net, a really trying to help a very wide audience to understand the insight that economics can give you, and therefore it's empowering, right? If you understand better how the world works, then you have much more chance of being engaged in trying to change it. And so it's that step from understanding towards engagement and empowerment that I think is really important. But we have to change the pipeline. We have to have a much more diverse flow into university economics. It's too dominated, I'm afraid, Ben, by white males, and that's clearly not your fault, but we've got to make this a more attractive pursuit for women, for other underrepresented groups. And the core project is really trying to do that. We have this article called 300,000 Missing Women, and we're trying to do that by saying that and there's some evidence that women are more driven by problems and by trying to acquire tools that help them to understand and engage with problems, and they're less sort of instrumental in getting a credential, which is what drives perhaps a segment into economics, who are not that interested in economics. Actually, they're interested in the piece of paper or the digital version that gets them a particular kind of job.
Yeah, I think that's so, because we've discussed this on the series before with Sarah Smith, who's our head of department here, and that's a massive passion of hers, obviously, is getting more diversity into economics. But it's also striking me because you were talking earlier about how it was only after the financial crisis you went back, you wrote your third book with David Soskis, integrating the financial system. But to an outsider, just an idea from me, someone close to me, you said, oh, you do economics, money goes up, money goes down. But it's actually, it's like you say, it's about problem solving. It's not actually about that narrow finance. It's just that weird perception that comes from outside that, yeah, like you say, well, when that's changed, we'll get a better pipeline.
Yeah, I mean, if you just Google economist, then you get a white man waving a chart. That's it, I'm afraid to say. So, that's the image you get. So that's what we have to change. And but that's up to, I think that getting students out into schools and the kind of work that Sarah is doing, and now there's a really impressive network, Discover Economics. It's the Royal Economic Society is pushing it. It's being led by Maeve Cohen. You should get her on. She's fabulous, and she was really important in the Manchester student group trying to change economics after the financial crisis. And she's now pushing this diversity, discover economics movement. So yeah.
Okay.
It takes a lot of time though, and but it's an international thing. There are people doing it all around the world pursuing this, and there's emerging research about what works, what doesn't. Mentors really work. So that's something that we know. If you see a woman teaching you, then that's more likely to make you think that this could be for you. So, you know, there's obviously a bit of a chicken and egg problem there, but yeah, we know that having mentors works. We're trying to test in a rigorous way whether having different content, so being taught with core rather than ManQ, whether that has an effect on the pipeline. You can't test it in the UK, but you can in the US, because students in the US come into university without having chosen a degree. And so if you expose them randomly to a first course, either using core versus one using ManQ or a traditional approach, then you can see whether you get more retention, more choices of a major in economics, and who chooses to do that. Is there a disproportionate effect on women and other underrepresented minorities? So we're trying to do that in a study at Colorado State, and we should have some results in a couple of years, because we have to wait for them to then go on and choose their major.
Yeah, let's stick with that optimistic rethinking, reshaping economics theme. You recently published an article on the IMF Finance and Development site talking about the new paradigm after the pandemic. This is what I really wanted to get onto tonight. Can you talk about how we've sort of what the pandemic has done, obviously beyond the disease, and how it's shifted from that left-right traditional paradigm to add a third dimension of civic society?
Yeah, civil society. Yeah, sure. Maybe, do you think I should stick up the triangle so people could see it?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Is that going to be helpful? Okay, let me see if I can find it. Here we go. That, by the way, that you can see now is the table, a version of the table with the conventional benchmark. So let's get rid of that and see. Yeah. So this is, well, actually, let's start with this. I won't bother. Can you see it okay, Ben? I mean, I'm not going to
perfect
with the presentation. Yeah. So the basic idea is that the way that we've typically say the neoliberal paradigm, or paradigms up until now, have typically been along this one-dimensional this space with markets at one side and government on the other, right? And there's just like a push me, pull you between different from the Keynesian social democratic paradigm to the neoliberal one, just was a push toward the market side along here. And I think to give you the idea of what I mean by the two ends, the poles, then it relates to motivation. So look at the market one over here. You can see the motivation is material incentives. Look over at the government. The motivation is compliance with state authority. So markets and governments can do very different things. And how are things implemented? Well, by markets through prices and competition. In the sort of benchmark case with complete contracts. Government, you can implement allocations by fiat, by state authority and by elections. And so you can think of mixtures, just to pick two of these policies to reduce carbon emissions along the top. They're just different combinations of markets and government. A cap and trade is more market, a carbon tax and dividend is more government. So that probably gives you, like a starting point. And as Ben said, what we did was to say that there's something missing here, and the thing that's missing is actually provided in contemporary economics. So we can bring in these additional motivations. So see down this, there's now this third pole. And the big thing about when you have a third pole, you open up a space, right? Instead of just shunting backwards and forwards along this line, you've now got a space. And the motivations now include reciprocity, altruism, fairness, sustainability. But in case you were thinking this was all kind of cozy and fuzzy, warm feeling down here in civil society, it's also the place where you get identity, tribalism, in-group motivation. So it's not like it's somehow all very cozy down here. And here, allocations are implemented through social norms and the exercise of private power. Those two things are fantastically important. Social norms, wearing masks, for example, the exercise of private power, employers forcing workers to turn up to work in meat processing plants, even though it's unsafe, right? There's no way of talking about those things, which have become very prominent in the pandemic, just along that blue government market axis. So we'd really thought about this, worked on this ahead of the pandemic, and published a first article in January a year ago. And in that very short article, we did actually mention pandemic, which was quite good, I think. Then the pandemic came along, and this was the original version where this was nothing to do with the pandemic, but we just tried to show how you could populate this space with things that are really important for understanding how the economy works and for developing economic policy. So you can see things inside the triangle like open source software, relationships within conventional firms. Okay, the relationship between the employer and the worker, it doesn't fit along the government markets axis because it requires both an understanding and a way to model the exercise of private power of the employer over the worker, but also of social norms. So like, working conscientiously, for example, doing a good job is a social norm. So that's the kind of space of the that's opened up. And then the test case was the pandemic. So you can see a whole number of things that happened in the pandemic that's fine, that fit along the top here. So like this reallocation of labor, 20,000 Qantas workers become contact tracers. They obviously became really good contact tracers in Australia. They seem to have nailed that one. There's also reallocation of labor, Amazon hires 100,000 workers. So those things in the pandemic and the mandatory risk sharing, the massive intervention of the government in supporting livelihoods, fit along the blue government markets dimension. But then so many other things that we've observed require us to be using this third pole to understand how things have worked. So that's both the kind of genesis and then the application of the framework. And as Ben said, another short article just published today in the IMF Finance and Development tries to explain this sort of testing the framework with COVID-19. Yeah, so is that enough?
Yeah, that's perfect. I've shared the IMF article in the chat as well, so I'd definitely encourage everyone to go and read that. But just on that, I was going to ask, how does the third pole, the civil society, how does this link into, there's quite a groundswell, I'd say, at the moment of people talking about the meaning of value. Your UTL colleague, Marianne Mazzucato, Mark Carney's Reith lectures talking about moral to market sentiments. How does value come into civil society? Sorry.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, and it comes back really to the paradigm question. So the idea that we're trying to sort of develop is that a successful paradigm has to have normative foundations. It has to have foundations in values. Okay, that's not something that economists are really often terribly comfortable with. But the pandemic, I think, has kind of put the, it said, well, you just can't not take this seriously. And the same is true of climate, for example. I mean, when you're just thinking about, what's the discount rate that you should be using in the analysis of climate policies? What weight should we be placing on future generations relative to the current generation? Should we use the same discount rate that we use when we're making our own individual decisions, like using the interest rate? Well, no, not really. There's no reason why we should weight people in the future differently from people now. It's not like us deciding on shifting our consumption, but from the future to the present or the present to the future. It's a completely different question. And it is a normative question, and we have to be prepared to engage since we're going to be thinking about policies. So the idea is you've got to have normative foundations. You've then got to have a model, and those two things have to go together. So they have to be complementary. And that's how the previous successful paradigms have had their kind of appeal. So you've got to have layer at the bottom, normative foundation. So they're the value judgments, as you mentioned, that, for example, Mark Carney spent a lot of time in his Reith lectures on. Then there's the complementary economic model, the economic model that has to match the normative foundations. And that's where I think the model that sits in the new benchmark and that's used in core is a good play. That's kind of good progress because they fit together. And then you have the economic policies built on top of that. And then at the very top, you have the language. How do you explain this? How do you motivate people about this new paradigm? And so what we call the vernacular or the everyday speech is something like cooperation works in the case of the pandemic. So that's a different kind of vernacular from like the neoliberal vernacular that might be the government that governs best governs least, right? So that's kind of the idea, right, of how these four levels fit to, are the background to creating this new space for thinking about policies. Yeah, so
that's what I liked so much about the article, because intrinsically to me straight away it felt like, why are we trying to impose moral language on it? But then, as you say, behind every other paradigm there has been a language as well, and this is just the latest evolution of the language. Because immediately I think, well, Arrow's impossibility theorem, how do we aggregate everyone's preferences in a way? But can you answer that? How do we?
Yeah, so that's great. I mean, Arrow is this sort of amazingly complex genius who, on the one hand, produced these sort of impossibility results and was, sat right there in the middle of, really important results in general equilibrium and welfare economics. And on the other side, he was this passionate person who cared very deeply about inequality. So there was a sort of tension, and it's a shame really, because he would have, that he actually lived to a very old age, but he's exactly the kind of person who would be just fantastic to have these sort of arguments with, and to sort of try and make progress in constructing this new paradigm. So this is under construction. So this is trying to inspire you to, to join this project.
No, it definitely has, because again, I think this might be going back to Mark Carney, but just the idea that even accounting, which seems such a scientific, just purely numerical basis, so many value judgments in that. In the comparison of the Amazon, the jungle versus Amazon, the company, one is only valued when it's chopped down. It's something that you don't think about has value judgments, but everything does. That's what I think brilliant is, that you're bringing that to the forefront and making people forcing them to have those perhaps uncomfortable conversations.
Yeah. And you're right. It really cuts to measurement questions very very directly. And again, I think you learn a lot by looking back at for example, what happened after the Second World War, and that's when national income accounts emerged. And so we got all of this measurement about flows, and the great old C plus I plus G and blah blah that we all learn, and that's how we measure the economy, and that's why everyone thinks that economists are so in some sense kind of narrow-minded, because they just focus on GDP and GDP growth. But it came out, it developed for a really good reason, because it was incredibly important to measure the pressure of demand in the economy when you had a Great Depression. So that was the right measurement for the moment. It's not the right measurement for the moment now, and we need to have a different way of measuring the economy and measuring progress. And we need to be thinking in terms of stocks and natural capital, not in terms of flows, because the problem is not the one for which GDP and national accounts was developed to address.
Do you place, just thinking about new ways to measure it, do you place any weight on Kate Raworth's donut concept?
I think it's, I mean, the sort of donut picture is like the picture actually in core that has the economy and then society and then the biosphere. So I wouldn't call it a donut, because that kind of sort of makes you think that, at least in our representation, the economy is somehow empty, and that seems like that does not seem to be a good characterization. But I think she's like a lot of people, has really raised consciousness and awareness about the problems that we're facing, and the kinds of tools that need to be used. And some of the mechanisms that she's mobilizing, and I think there's like a application in Amsterdam, for example. You can see how that fits inside this triangle. She might not like a triangle, but anyway. And I think she's not that keen on necessarily on some of what I would put very much in the economic model. But there's the division of labor. She wouldn't sort of style herself as an economist. So we have different comparative advantages.
I'm conscious that I've probably gone on way too long here, so I'm going to now go to questions. We don't actually have that many, so that's why I've sort of allowed myself to go on, but we do have one here from Anna. How much do you think the history of economic thought has, how much of a role do you think history of economic thought has in economics education? Does it help to contextualize conventional models, or does it distract from learning more current models that better describe the economy?
I think there's really a place for learning learning the history of economic thought. I did it, as I said, when I was an undergraduate. I found it incredibly fascinating, but I don't think it's a substitute for learning a coherent model that helps you really understand the economy, because that's what I think is empowering. Having a variety of having a knowledge of different schools of thought is good, because different schools of thought are sources of inspiration for creating this coherent way of understanding how the world works. So we use this phrase pluralism by integration, which is what core is, right? It's just as happy to use ideas from Hayek as from Marx. But there's an alternative, which is pluralism by juxtaposition. And that's like, looking at the contrasts between Hayek and Marx, rather than saying, what can Hayek and Marx, or Marx and Coase is a good example, contribute to our understanding of relations within the firm. So the juxtaposition, the kind of competing schools of thought is really important and interesting, but it's just a different thing. And I think both are very valuable, and I encourage people to take a course in history of economic thought if you get the chance.
Yeah, I think, as again, just to paraphrase Keynes, you don't want to be a slave to defunct economists, Steve. But at the same time, they've got a lot to offer.
Yeah.
But you don't want to make the mistake of addressing new problems like the pandemic, which clearly we haven't really faced before, apart from 1918, but with old tools. And that's why I think, as you say, this new vernacular and this new paradigm is so important.
Yeah, I think the one thing I felt, worried about is when people who are sometimes drawn in by a course in different models of economic thought, is the feeling you somehow have to align yourself with one or the other, and I think that's just terribly dangerous. So people used to have to say, well, I'm a Keynesian or I'm a monetarist. Really bad idea. Keynesian economics is fantastic for understanding certain problems, but a Friedman, for example, is very useful in understanding other problems. So we should be open-minded and not feel that we have to kind of, tie ourselves to one or other kind of school of thought.
Yeah, and that's exactly what you do in core. There's some strange bedfellows from Hayek right through to Marx. But again, I think the key message perhaps to take away from tonight is humility and also diversity of economists, of data from around the world. And that's something, again, that's all incorporated into core. Lots of collaborators, lots of different countries, and that's going to lead to better outcomes, fingers crossed.
Yes, exactly. Can I just show people one little toy that they might like to play with?
Oh, yes, please do. Yes.
Yeah, just let me do this just because you might find it interesting if I can find where it's gone. Ben knows I actually tidied up my desk before this, before we started. So yeah, so this is on the core website. Explore COVID transmission using networks. It's really fun. What you can do is you can get it going. It allows you to change the probability of infecting someone. It allows you to change the number of nodes in your network. Your network is a disease transmission network, and it's also an economic network where there are gains from trade because you're connected with other people. You can also introduce social distancing. So just let's have a look what happens. This is the disease transmission network. Okay. And this is what happens period by period as people get infected. You'll have to have a look at more detail. I just want to show you. That's the epidemic curve. You've seen all these kind of curves that look like this. You can calculate the R value as well. This is the economic cost. I was playing with this before, so it had some red lines. This is the economic cost of your epidemic, and this is the effect on inequality. All right, I'm showing the Gini coefficient. Now, if we introduce some social distancing, this is all randomized, by the way, so that you get a different draw every time you play with it. So if I have social distancing, I can bring the peak of the epidemic forward. What about the economic cost? Have a look at what happens to the economic cost. When you bring social distancing, you have a big peak in the economic cost right up front. So that might be considered unfortunate. What about the effect on inequality? You have an increase in inequality earlier on, but because the epidemic lasts for a shorter period, the period of higher inequality is shorter. Okay, so that's your fun thing to do. You can increase the number of nodes and play around with it and think about what both the epidemic characteristics and the economic characteristics of the pandemic are. So you can imagine a new variant, for example, that's more transmissible and explore its implications.
Thank you. That looks more exciting than tutorial prep work. I've just popped that link in the chat for everyone. I don't know whether Richard, I don't know whether he wants to have a final word, but we are slightly out of time.
Hi, Wendy. Thank you. This has been fascinating. Just one thing from me that you didn't touch on which is I'm not sure the students are always aware of just what an international network they're part of by studying core. You mentioned Chile, which is obviously really, really interesting. And just as an aside, if people think that things never change, well, those students that are involved in those revolts in 2006 and then 2011, 2012, they've now become MPs, and a couple of them are tipped to become president of the country. They're too young at the moment. You have to be 35 in Chile, and the two people in question are about 32. So yeah, so things really do change, and they change for economic reasons. But what's next for core internationally? I know that you're involved across the world, different universities. Just 2 or 3 of the latest international things that you've got going on. I'm sure people would be fascinated to hear about.
Okay, so we have a translation project in Vietnam. So the National Economics University in Hanoi is translating the economy. So that's going to be very exciting. We have core has been adopted in India by the Kerala State University, so the whole state university system in India. And thanks to Richard, we are hoping that core in French is going to make its way into Francophone Africa. Maybe Richard, you could mention what you've been doing there.
Yeah, we're going to try and launch it. I personally took a book down to Kinshasa, Kinshasa being the capital of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I argue the largest economic failure of the past 100 years, and hundreds and hundreds of kids studying economics there, and just no resources at all. And we took a couple of copies down. It's now translated into French, and I'm going to start teaching it in the main university there, which will be an amazing outcome. Because they haven't got textbooks, but they have got a cellular network, and they can get hold of smartphones. So really, really big opportunity.
Yeah, I think just one last word, that it's the technology aspect of the project that's also one of its most exciting elements. It's the first kind of multi-format publishing project of this kind. So we publish directly to the web, to apps, and push out the pages for print out of the same engine. And that means with all the errata, everything gets corrected at the same time, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of emphasis on light apps and web, and also offline, so that people who don't have broadband can access the material. So this is another very exciting aspect of the project. It would have been impossible, even like 15 years ago, to imagine this kind of use of a free online, pre-sophisticated interactive learning tool around the world, already in many languages. And the language projects are all bottom up. They're organized from the base, from universities, not by us. Is it also used in secondary schools? Yep. The French are the leaders who have a secondary school version you can find on the website. And that's out there in at least 600 secondary schools in the Versailles region of France. So, we're really enthusiastic about secondary school versions, but, there's only a certain number of hours in the day. And but we're always recruiting people who want to get involved in the project.
Yeah, it's a perfect place to end it. Yeah, I'm very aware, running a project of this scale and this complexity, your time is very precious. So we really do appreciate you giving up this time for us this evening. I think it's been very insightful. So thank you so much, Wendy, and thank you to everyone for joining.
Yeah, no, thank you. I've really enjoyed it. And thanks, Ben. You were unbelievably well prepared. So congratulations.